Morning. We are continuing to work through our material here in First Peter, and we're looking at First Peter 4, verses 12 through 19. And there's a lot, I think, that's going on here, and the article this video is going to be attached to is just sort of scratching the surface of what's there and of how it works. But as I was processing through that article, I had a bit of another train of thought, and it got me thinking, and that's sort of the catalyst for this here. Here's the idea. 1 Peter 4, 12 through 19 talks about embracing our suffering in understanding that it is, as he said in chapter 1, verse 7, right? It is going to produce the testing and prove the genuineness of our faith and our life with Christ. And so that's part of this, right? We are to face our test and our trial with an eye on the fact that we are being purified. Things are being removed from our lives so that we are more like Jesus when it comes to the end of it. Second, the way that we embrace and approach and live into those moments of testing and trial will either unite us with the suffering that Christ has already accomplished on our behalf, or it will distance us from that. And so we can, in a way, carry our cross with Christ, or we can endure the suffering in a way that is not walking with, but is sort of, I don't know, the image in my head is a bit more like a toddler who's struggling to do what you ask and sort of stomping their feet. It probably helps that I have 4 young children at home, and so I see this sometimes. But here's the sideline of thought for me. Historically, the church has always thrived when it has been the minority and when it has been a group of persecuted few. And then when the church rises to some set of prominence in history, and it becomes the religion of a given empire or kingdom, or it becomes the manner of life in a given culture, or it becomes the dominant player, often what happens is it gets convoluted with other things that crowd it out. It gets politicized, or it gets imperialized. And instead of the purity of the gospel, it gets turned into something that becomes something it's not necessarily supposed to be. And so colonization and imperialized attempts to politically dominate parts of the globe became entangled with the church goal that in its purity would have been evangelistic, like the Apostle Paul or like the Apostle Peter and John, in leading peaceful and quiet lives, but converting people to the hope of the gospel of Christ. And instead, imperialism and colonization turned that endeavor into a sort of politicized version of what was Christian. And it did 2 things. Number one, it established an entanglement that I think is not healthy for the church, and that entanglement is the church and politics. While the church has answers to a lot of political conundrums and issues and concerns, and the anthropology and the theology and the teachings of love and truth and grace and humility and what is morally right and upstanding, those things are there in the scripture, and they're there in the church, and they're there to be accessible, and they're there to be good things. Those things get muddied, they get confused, they get altered, they get shifted when the church and the political sphere become entangled. And I think especially in the political and philosophic West, this has become a particular problem. Christianity has been a dominant player in world affairs in the life of Europe and the United States. And there's sort of a repeatable pattern here. When Christianity became the dominant player in the Roman Empire, and when when it came to dominate both the political landscape, thanks to Constantine and growth in that direction, and the religious landscape, then the political world couldn't hold on any longer, and it began to dissolve, and the Roman world began to collapse and fall apart. And when it did that in Europe, the same kinds of things began to happen. When it does it in the United States, or when it did it in the United States, those same kinds of things began to happen. There is a saturation point where Christianity and politics will get along with one another. But when Christianity becomes too entangled in the political, and the political begins to dominate our Christianity, then we lose the heart of the gospel. We lose the mission and the standing of the church. We cease to become the church. We just become another political group with a religious name tag on it. But the pattern of history is this: as Christianity becomes the dominant player and it gets entangled in the politics, then two things happen. The church loses what the church is, and the political spectrum seems to fall apart at the seams. And there's upheaval, and there's chaos, and there's collapse in a lot of places. The Roman Empire falls apart shortly after Christianity becomes the player in the Roman world, both legally and in a majority sense. Europe does the same thing. There's a saturation point between the political spheres of the divided empires and kingdoms of Europe and the church. And when that saturation point reaches a threshold that's no longer tolerable, the church needed reform. It ceased to be what the church was intended to be, and the political specter of what Europe was began to disintegrate and fall apart and descend into struggle and strife and difficulty and challenge. And it repeated. And this isn't to say that this happens only with Christianity. This happens with everything. But it is a particular problem for me because I'm a Christian. And so I struggle with this. And I'm watching the landscape around us in the United States today. And a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the Christianity that I see on display is political, not necessarily gospel. The gospel and the truth of Christian faith will challenge any and every political group and political idea. It doesn't matter. The call and the challenge that I think is present in the text of 1 Peter for where we might be headed in the United States is it's harsh, I think, and it's stark, and it makes me wonder. It makes me worry a little, I guess. Christianity thrives when it's persecuted. If you look at the fastest growing places for Christianity today, it's places where the church is illegal and persecuted and underground. If you look at the places where people are clinging to the truth of the gospel, where people are having revelatory experiences like Paul's on the road to Damascus, it's places where the church is persecuted, where it's minimal, where it's definitely not the majority. And then you look at the United States. And so much of our political spectrum is a total mess because it's people. But so much of the church is too. And I think we have reached that threshold. The United States, and it's probably been 50 or 60 years, I think, since we've reached that threshold. The 60s, I think, were the tipping point. The 1960s, where the political and the politicized entanglements of the Christian worldview hit that saturation point. They hit that moment where the two could no longer sustain what they were and what they were separately, and fusing them together has led to a deterioration of them both. I think it's time for the church to revisit what it means to be the church, especially in the United States. And I think it's time for Christians to start having an awareness that being a Christian today may quickly become being the minority. And while that might be scary because so many of us have been Christians as sort of a dominant worldview for such a long time, that not being in that not being in that majority may be intimidating. But I think the hope in that is quite simply this: every time Christianity has been the minority, the church has been boiled down to a remnant, to a purified core that adhere to the truth. And then that truth begins to penetrate again. That truth begins to radiate again. That truth becomes concentrated instead of watered down. And that concentrated version becomes powerful and effective. And the church rises again. It takes a while, and it's difficult, and it's arduous, and it's a challenging process. It is a true testing. It's a true trial. It's a true suffering. So as we perhaps are looking down the tunnel of what might become a Christian minority in the West, in worldview, perhaps it's time we revisit our commitments. Perhaps it's time we reconsider what it looks like to be led by the Spirit in the life that we lead, to be sanctified, to lead a life that Christ calls us to lead. I think we're really at a place where a new day is dawning, and there's a new opportunity for the church. There's also a new challenge for the church. And that new challenge is being what the church was founded to be. So the question for us today is quite simply this: will we face our testing and our trial with the glory of God in mind and with being made more into the image of Christ in mind? Have a good Wednesday.